Hello, gentle viewer. So I'm obviously in Philadelphia at the moment, but I wanted to make a reaction review of this while it was still fresh in my mind. So I watched this movie on the way down because frankly there wasn't much to see on the in-flight entertainment system. That was I think one of the better things Air Canada's done over the years is they've implemented in-flight entertainment. So there's like a touch screen in front of you and they have a selection of movies. Actually not a terrible selection. A lot of them are new releases, some kind of old ones. But for someone like me, I appreciate it. Just it gives me something to do. Like I think I watched 3 movies when I flew to Spain, but I digress. So the problem is though, I'd actually seen most of the movies. That's not really their fault. It's just I see a lot of films in theaters because I really like movies. So yeah, I saw these movies in theaters, and of those that I hadn't seen, the only one that kind of really looked interesting was The Death of Stalin. And I had very low expectations. I thought this was just going to kind of be a quirk movie that didn't really have much to do with the source material, that it wouldn't really capture anything about the Soviet Union, about the actual death of Stalin, that it was going to kind of be some maybe obtuse metaphor for modern day American politics. But I was pleasantly surprised. I actually really liked the movie. And I just wanted to kind of talk about it in the context of trying to make a historical film, because it's very difficult trying to make a historical film because there's a lot of very contradictory elements, or I guess kind of contradictory considerations that you have to try to take into account when you're filming. So firstly, you want it to be historically accurate as much as possible. You want to get the names right, the historical figures right, the strategies, the battle tactics, the countries, the armor, like all these things you want to get accurate. At a basic level, you want to not only entertain but educate your audience. And this is easier said than done because there's kind of contradictory elements to it. Second, you want to make an understandable and entertaining movie. And it can get very difficult. Even if you're familiar with the source material, there's so many different, often historical characters. Some of them are not particularly important, except they did one thing. Sometimes you don't know a ton about their personality. It can be hard to follow. Like I said, even if you know something about the movie, like about the time period, it can still be very difficult. So you want to give the individual characters their own personalities. You want to kind of flesh them out. You want to create a coherent narrative. But it's difficult because a lot of times, especially when you're dealing with like ancient history or classical history or whatever, you just don't have that clear an image. So to try to make it coherent, you'll have to combine characters. You'll have to try to make characters maybe have more of a clear personality or conform more to an archetype or something like that. And that can sacrifice some historical accuracy, but at the same time, it makes it much more of a coherent and enjoyable movie. And then you also have, do you want to kind of focus on the theme of the time or the spirit of the time, or do you want to focus on the actual events? So a film that I think really kind of exemplifies a lot of this is Gladiator. So Gladiator obviously is the film about, theoretically at least, the end of the 7 good emperors, or is it 5 good emperors? Anyways, it's the end of that dynasty in the beginning of the crisis of the 3rd century, starring Joaquin Phoenix as Commodus and Russell Crowe as a character, as Maximus, who isn't really a specific historical figure, but is mostly based on Pertinax. Now, does he really have that much in common with Pertinax? No. And Joaquin Phoenix's Commodus is actually less crazy and more competent and less obsessed with gladiators than the historical one was. Actually, that looks really cool. I'll have to go there later and see that exhibit. But yeah, so you kind of got this issue where we don't really know the ton about Pertinax, or he's not that interesting kind of a protagonist to really relate to, and maybe Commodus was going to be a bit too crazy to kind of make an interesting and somewhat sympathetic villain. So you have that. Did Marcus Aurelius really want to restore the Republic when he died? I don't know, to be perfectly honest. I think some people would say yes, some people would say no, but I think it kind of follows or stems from a fundamental Roman uneasiness with the empire. There was always those who longed for a return to the Republic, or a return to a bigger, a more representative form of government, whereas the plebs and a lot of kind of other people were happy with autocracy, so long as they had their bread and circuses. So I think whatever the flaws of it are, Gladiator does, I think they kind of made the right decisions. They took as much historical stuff as possible, and they had to alter it quite significantly to try to make a coherent narrative. But at the same time, they decided to try to focus on kind of some eternal themes in Rome. And I think the Death of Stalin does a pretty good job of that. It does get the historical characters right. This period is not something I'm super familiar with. I have read a couple books that include this, but it's not something I'm extremely familiar with. As far as I can tell, just from my own knowledge and what I've read, this is a pretty accurate depiction of the death of Stalin. Because when Stalin died, you did have the whole thing where he had a heart attack and then he just lay on the floor for a full day because people were so afraid to go into his room and they were so afraid to do anything. Like in the movie, they're unwilling to even get a doctor, probably in part because they were hoping that he would just die while lying on the floor and they wouldn't have to deal with him anymore, and also out of fear because Stalin would kill you over a dinner joke he didn't find funny. Whereas, who knows, if you even saw him on the floor like that, then that might be grounds for execution, to see him at his weakest point, even though you didn't actually do anything. So people were just, oh, that's pretty cool, very reluctant to do anything, and ultimately he dies. And before he's even in the ground, we have this Kafka-esque kind of, from my understanding, they didn't even satirize it that much, because this was just how things went out, how things wound up happening. The power struggle. So you have like Khrushchev, you have Malenkov, and you have Molotov, and you have Beria. And I think it's fairly accurate the way they're portrayed. Khrushchev is kind of, from everything I've read, described as being a little like Steve Buscemi, being kind of very shrill, very kind of aggressive personality, a real kind of wheeler dealer, making jokes, not being particularly bright. Whereas Malenkov is described as being kind of this somber, intellectual figure. I think that the person they probably got the most wrong was Beria, because from what I've read, he was a complete and total monster. He was a total psychopath who used the well, you have to be a psychopath to be the head of the NKVD, but he used them to basically just grab attractive women, to rape them, and if they resisted, to kill them and hide their remains. And I think this was touched on in the movie, but it wasn't particularly obvious to me what was going on. But, yeah, so you get into the power struggle. You have Stalin's kids, Svetlana and Vasily, and they both kind of have their own eccentric personalities, and people are struggling over them. And you do see kind of this power vacuum, because Stalin was such an absolute ruler. There isn't like a very exceedingly clear what happens next. So it's pretty interesting. You have the rise and fall of Beria as the fact that he's the NKVD leader, and he's probably going to become another Stalin. Nobody wants him in charge. Another kind of interesting thing is immediately after Stalin died, they stopped the treason trials and they stopped the political arrests and executions, because they were just so exceedingly unpopular that even like Beria and even the kind of hardliners realized that they were nonsensical, like that the 99% of the people weren't actually traitors. They were just Stalin killing people to keep the terror going. So you have that. It just they do kind of play up the comedic part, but just kind of how absurd the thing is. Like it is a Kafka. It's literally a Kafka drama, because Kafka's kind of about the absurdities of the Slavic way of life. But yeah, it's very much like that. It's very much like a kind of also Dostoevsky kind of thing. But no, I really liked the movie. I was not really expecting to like it that much. It also kind of was interesting to see the factions that formed, like between the hardliners and the, I don't know what you want to call them, the liberalists. I actually kind of sympathize more with the liberalists, because even though Khrushchev did some bad things involving like feminism and some of kind of the other socially liberal stuff, the age of Stalin had to end. The Kafka treason trials, just the general madness. Millions of people died in labor camps under Stalin. The government was kind of the policy was incoherent. It was solely based on whim, etc. And it had to end, and I think Khrushchev ending it and acknowledging the mistakes and trying to fix them was ultimately a good thing, even if there were things he did that I strongly disagree with. So he's kind of the closest thing this film has to a protagonist, but even then it's kind of shows very strongly, thus is the way of all flesh. Regardless of who's in power, there's always going to be coup and counter coup, especially within a society as crazy as Russia. I do really like how they portray Zhukov as just kind of this buffoonish, brash, full of bravado guy. Because that is kind of the way he was historically. I do really like Zhukov. He's one of my favorite figures of World War II. Just kind of an interesting little historical fact about him. Zhukov was a huge Coca-Cola fan. He consumed that stuff by the liter. However, he didn't want to be seen as decadently chugging down the capitalist beverage of choice. So what he wound up doing was he got them to specially make him white Coca-Cola, where they just didn't put the dye in, and he just pretended it was vodka, which I think is hilarious. But yeah, he was actually a very good friend of Dwight Eisenhower, and they corresponded after the war. I always kind of find these war friendships to be really interesting. A lot of those happened during the Civil War, which is also kind of cool. A lot of it's interesting. I forget if it was, I think it was Johnson, who would never let a bad word be said about Sherman. Because as brutal as Sherman was, he was very reconciliatory once the Confederates surrendered. And I think it was, I forget, there was one general who died at another's funeral because he was a pallbearer and it was raining and he got pneumonia. But interesting movie. I'd recommend it. And yeah, that's the reaction review.